We've talked about Mormon women just not ever considering themselves sexual beings. So all the messaging around sex within Mormonism as a young girl is don't wear this, don't wear that, behave. It's your job to keep the Mormon boy pure and healthy. So there's nothing around sex is great. You can really enjoy sex someday. It can be a really important and healing part of your life or a really nurturing part of your life. Get to know yourself, get to know your body, masturbate, even if that helps you get in tune with enjoying sex and sexual satisfaction, knowing what your arousal template is, and then helping you come into a marriage, knowing and believing that you're a sexual being, knowing what does turn you on or work for you in terms of arousal. None of that is allowed. And so you're just stuck in this situation where you don't even think of yourself as supposed to be enjoying this. It's sort of your duty to allow your husband to pleasure himself. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay. So how did that, so 2 years of that, talk about how that evolves and how that, does it come to a breaking point and how?
The breaking point was he stopped wearing his garments and told me he didn't want to go to church anymore, which gave me my out because I'd made a covenant in the temple with God, and it wasn't even directly with him. So if he was breaking that covenant, I was out. So when people talk about how you shouldn't leave just because your spouse, or you shouldn't divorce just because your spouse leaves, it's like, that's 100% why I left. It's not because of the way he treated me at all, because I thought it was normal. It was, he left, he took off his garments and didn't want to go to church anymore.
And that gets you out of the marriage, but it doesn't heal you.
No,
right?
No, it doesn't heal me, but at least I'm now out of the marriage. I'm out of the situation. And so, yeah, so I am still 100%. I don't know what healthy boundaries are. I don't know what healthy sexuality looks like. I don't know. Well, there are also all kinds of things I still don't know, but I am at least out of that marriage.
Got it. Okay. And so how did that progress? What came next in your life?
I was, what came next in my life? I was still in college. I was now.
So you divorced as a BYU student?
No, we'd actually moved down to southern Utah because he wanted to get away from Utah County. So he picked a place in southern Utah to get away from both my family and Utah County Mormons. And so we moved down there, and I was still in college. So I was still going to college. Knew that I was supposed to get married in the temple again, but really hesitant this time. So dated quite a bit. Eventually got married in the temple again a few years later. And
so you got married again?
I did get married again.
And were you able to go to did you go to the bishop? Did you ever talk to your bishop about how your first husband had treated you? Did you ever try and involve the bishop in that? And what was the bishop like?
Yeah, the bishop said it was my job to keep he just reinforced it was my job to keep my husband happy, and I was spending too much time out of the home. So he said, there's 5 things that you're doing outside of the home. You have 2 jobs, you're going to school, you see your family, and I was volunteering at that point for to help with eating disorder recovery. I did speaking and stuff. He said, there's 5 things that are keeping you out of your home, that are keeping you from not doing your duty as a wife. What of those are you willing to give up so that you can do your duty as a wife to keep your husband happy? So there was nowhere in there that was about, and again, I didn't know rape was a thing, and I just knew I was unhappy and he was unhappy. So that was So I didn't talk to him about abuse. I just talked to him about this marriage is unhappy, and this was his solution.
So, when you talk about pillows over your face, that, to some of us, that's just like, well, that's clearly abuse, right? What would keep you from, again, saying, this guy, Bishop, this guy is abusing me. He's raping me against my consent. Is it just a lack of education about what consent is and how healthy sexuality should be? Is it just a lack of sexual education?
Lack of sexual education and a lack of I just had nowhere else to go. If this marriage didn't work out, remember, I got married because I was trying to prove my worth. So I had nowhere else to go. So what am I going to do if I say and it's my fault and there's something wrong with me and I'm the one that couldn't make this marriage work. So again, it was so deeply in me that it's my fault that I couldn't leave until he took off his garments, and then it's not my fault anymore. And
so you were kind of trapped in the marriage because to leave it would be disappointing everyone who had supported you through the eating disorder. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you were just trapped.
Yeah, and it just never crossed my mind to go anywhere for help.
Right.
I just didn't know that. He did actively threaten, my sister, who was only 12 at the time. He says, "You've seen what I can do to you. Imagine what I can do to her." And so there was also pretty strong, threats if you talk about these things or if you make me mad. So there was that going on too.
So just this fear of what could happen to you if you turned him in, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't have used the word rape. It took me probably 7 or 8 years after I divorced him to ever use that word.
What's wrong with that word? What was wrong with that word at the time?
Because rape is something that happens by a stranger in a dark alley. It doesn't happen when you're married.
That's what you thought.
Yeah.
Of the word.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I can't, and so that the word describes this dark experience, not something that happens in your bedroom and then you get up and go to work the next day and then come back and let it happen again.
Right. Okay. So you, did you seek help from a therapist to heal from these multiple experiences of trauma after your first divorce?
No. I did meet with meet with a bishop because again, who else are you going to go to? I met with the bishop, and so he was worried about eating disorder relapse and then finding a better husband in the next time that stayed temple worthy so that I could have a good temple marriage. So that was the extent of any therapy.
So it just seems like, again, we keep making these timeouts because we're trying to help bishops do better. Bishops should know that when someone's been abused, there's a diagnosis for that. It's called post-traumatic stress disorder. And trauma is a very significant form of a mental disorder. And it's something that requires an expert therapist, not just someone who's licensed as a marriage and family therapist or a social worker or even a psychologist. I have a PhD in psychology. I am not an expert on trauma, on PTSD. I would refer to another psychologist or therapist to treat PTSD as a PhD psychologist, because it's not just, moderate to mild depression or anxiety. PTSD is on the level of an eating disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder, in terms of severity, and you treat severe mental illness with an expert in that condition. So bishops need to not only just know that victims of post-traumatic stress disorder need expert help. It's not good enough to just contact your local LDS Family Services therapist and refer. They need to have a list of well-respected experts in post-traumatic stress disorder so that they can refer people to people who are actually going to help them, not just reinforce some of the messages like pray more, read your scriptures more, cling to the gospel, as I've heard some LDS Family Service therapists will do. They'll incorporate the gospel into their treatment in a way that actually reinforces the negative cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you want to add to that?
Nope,
Does that reflect what you think is
Mm-hmm.
useful as well?
Yes.
Okay. So you're back trying to find a new husband then after not having
kind of,
healed?
yeah.
So what happened?
I met a guy and we dated for 2 years, and
Active in the church, both of you?
yeah, both active in the church. In fact, we went to the temple once a week together while we were dating. And again, my focus was so strongly on I am going to earn a good life by my activity and involvement in the church. So we went to the temple once a week. I became a service missionary, volunteer interpreter for sign language at the Institute and at the MTC. So I was trying really hard and to be a good, righteous person. And we dated for 2 years. We also went camping and stayed in the same hotel room and slept in the same bed. And there was zero chastity law breaking. So I felt very comfortable around him that way. So eventually we got married.
So there are a couple comments I think that we want to bring in really quickly. There's a listener, JD Angela, who's basically saying this is not the norm. This is not, I guess he or she is a believer, and they're just basically constantly trying to say that this isn't how all Mormons are. This is how all Mormons are. What's your response to someone who's listening and saying, hey, all you people who are judging Mormons right now, don't judge Mormons by this experience? What would you say?
I'd agree with her, but I didn't know that. I really honestly believed that every woman I knew was being treated the same way. I'd agree with her though. My experience is way outside the norm because most men aren't rapists and most women enjoy sex and most women don't have the experiences I had. I absolutely agree with her. So the trouble is that there are people like me. I mean, if 1 in 4 are being sexually abused, and once you're abused, you're more likely for it to happen again. This trauma is built. That trauma exists within the church, and if you don't have anywhere to go or anywhere to heal, it just builds on itself. And I was turning to bishops for help because I didn't know where else to go,
Sure.
That's what I was taught. So at some point, a bishop could have pointed me over here and said, here, go to counseling. No, a really good one. That's what I'd agree with her. My experience is not normal.
Yeah, but even if it's 1 in 3, right? That's not normal. In other words, less than half experience it. But I have thousands of people who have written me talking about date rape at BYU, sexual abuse by their parents as a child, or by priesthood leaders, home teachers, and then as adults. So abuse, and Utah, as I understand it, leads the nation in certain forms of sexual abuse. So just because it only happens, let's just say 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 200, it's still important and it's still happening quite a bit and far too often.
Right. And I eventually got to a point where I'm trying to heal from this PTSD that I finally realized I have. It took me a few more years, and so I scoured LDS.org for a woman's right to say no, where I found articles on women should not focus on their right to say no, but their opportunity to say yes. That was it. And on abuse, there's Richard Scott's talks. He's got the 2 of them. Those were out there.
What do they say?
Well,
one says forgive your, it's like forgive your abusers.
And go to your bishop, because your bishop will help you. I mean, that's really like, and even that though, he gave another one actually when I was a little past this point, but that talk, I clung to it even though, because it was the only thing out there, and there was no information on LDS.org on how to help people.
Right. Did any of your bishops up to this point ever try and get you to go to a therapist, a PTSD expert?
No.
Okay. Yeah.
No, in fact, up to this point, the only one that even suggested therapy was the one that helped get treatment when I was still in high school.
Right.
Everybody else was pray more, read the scriptures.
Yeah, and I'll keep doing timeouts, but it's one thing to pursue religious devotion because you want to be religiously devout. As someone who has a PhD in psychology, it's a very different thing to be hyper-religious as a way to self-medicate or to cover up all these feelings of guilt and shame that you have from being victimized for so many years and not processing it effectively. So this stuff you were doing, 2 years of not, of attending the temple and serving the temple and being hyper-religious, that's actually not helping. It's like putting, carpet over a dead body. You can carpet layers and layers and layers of carpet on top of a dead raccoon, but it's going to be a misshapen floor to walk on, and it's going to ultimately really smell and be a disgusting experience. And I'm just coming up with that metaphor, but religiosity applied on top of trauma when the trauma hasn't been healed can actually not be a healthy thing. Now, exactly. I don't mean to put that into you, but that is
exactly my experience. And here's where I'd say the church saved my life in helping me get treatment. They also church is not quite as deadly as an eating disorder. So I became hyper-religious instead of starving myself. So it's not as deadly, and so it helped me cope with all of the crap. And it helped until all of a sudden it didn't.
Right.
That's really I wouldn't take the church away, because if you took the church away from the me that had just left my first husband and was broken, and you took that away, I think I would have crumbled. And so it's like that religiosity, I kind of needed it. Of course, so it's like, don't take it, if you've got somebody that's got the trauma and they're doing this, don't tell them it's all bullshit and they need to stop. That's not helpful either.
Right. And this is where it gets tricky, because when a religion is doing really well, it gets you the help you need so that you can heal, and then your religious participation is really healthy. So that's when a religion is performing optimally. When a religion is causing a lot of the shame and the self-loathing and the powerlessness, protecting the abusers, and then keeping you in the cycle of repentance as a way to self-medicate, repentance and service in the church as a way to self-medicate your lack of healing from the trauma, then it can turn into a bit of a sick cycle. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's when a well-intended religion can become toxic. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so you do 2 years of this dating this boy, and then what happens?
We get married again. We get married in the temple.
So this is your second marriage, temple marriage. This time it's going to be a good marriage.
Yes.
And you dated a lot, so you didn't rush into it.
Right, didn't rush into it. Knew him pretty well. And he wasn't a rapist. So it was like, oh, good, this is different. So I had that going for me. His only issue was that he would occasionally get really angry and then he'd get violent with me. So I am now all sorts of lost in this new like place of occasional violence. But he wasn't, I sound like I'm justifying, I'm not, but he wasn't controlling in the way I'd experienced. He wasn't, he just lost his temper and was violent, which is a very different experience than the constant control and micromanagement and you can't do anything without my say-so that I'd experienced before.
Okay. So there was still abuse in the marriage, just wasn't quite as bad.
Yes.
Okay. Did you report that to your bishop?
Yes.
The physical abuse?
Yes.
Okay.
I went to my bishop and I said, I'm afraid for my life. He's told me he could kill me. And the bishop gave me a book on communication titled Marriage for Better or Worse. He told me to go read it and that would help me.
What was the gist of that book?
That basically there's struggles in marriage and you just need to talk to each other, and I can't remember. But it was basically marriage is hard, so don't
join the club.
Yeah.
Stick it out. Man up, woman up. Marriage is hard.
Yeah. I mean, there may have been other good stuff in there, like, but
that's what you got from it.
Yeah. And my life is in danger part didn't seem to matter. So
to the bishop?
Yeah. I mean, so up to this point, talking to bishops, I've glossed over. I actually said, I'm afraid for my life. He's told me he could kill me. He has told me I'm lucky that he hasn't. And that was all I got, was this book. So I walked away with a okie dokie and kind of at that point gave up that there was, I mean, at that point I became incredibly suicidal. Not actively. It was like the way I'd comfort myself and I'd go to sleep at night and dream of tomorrow maybe I'll die in a car accident and this will all be over. Or maybe I'll fall down the stairs as I'm walking up the stairs at work and I'll break my neck and it'll all be over. That was kind of and that was like the way I comforted myself every night. And then I got pregnant, and pregnancy was incredibly triggering for trauma, to having another entity take over my body, and I pretty much lost my mind. So now the dissociation and the stuff that has kind of been distant for me is now a constant. I'm losing time at work. I'm losing time all over the place, and I'm just not okay. And I eventually miscarried and felt both guilt and relief over miscarrying.
And you probably felt guilt for feeling relief, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But that's where I was. I also had this feeling that it's like, I got to figure myself out. I got to get in a healthier place. I am not in I can't raise children. I don't want my kids to know their anger. I don't know if I can protect them if he were to get angry. I got to do something. But I didn't know what, so I relapsed into eating disorder. And round about this time is when I suddenly had this bishop calling me into his office every single month, like, come sit down and talk to me. And I'd given up on all bishops being helpful, but he kept calling and saying, come sit down and talk to me.
Really quick, we should have just noted that the bishop should have, in an ideal world, what should the bishop have done when you said, I fear for my life? he's threatening to kill me. What would you have wanted the bishop to do?
Do you have someplace you can go? We need to get you out of there. And to even say, I love you both, and we'll get him help and we'll get you help.
And people should know, again, that there are shelters. So in Cache Valley, there's this amazing shelter called CAPSA, and they have these homes that are hid in secret, and abuse victims can call women or children or even men and say, hey, I need a place to stay. And they'll check you in. You'll have a room. It's protected. You'll be as protected as you can from your abuser. And these are really phenomenal resources, shelters for battered women and children and even men. And these are, maybe that would have been helpful, along with possibly notifying the authorities about your abusive husband and or getting him help. Mm-hmm. What are you feeling and thinking right now?
Just being in that situation, it just felt so small and limited. And to think, and if I think about it now, if suddenly I was in an abusive situation, the person I am now is, I'm calling the police, I'm leaving, don't talk to me, and maybe we can show up in a therapy session at the same time. Like, the person I am now can stand up to that, but it was so small and so limited, and so I had nowhere to go. And that feeling of having nowhere to go other than the bishop, and the bishops didn't know what to do, but that was the best option, and it still sucked. Like, I had just that feeling of there's nowhere.
Yeah. And Mormon culture is so interesting. It's got to come from our history or, centuries of persecution. We really are isolated, distrusting, and disconnected from external resources of support. So you can just go back to Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce R. McConkie condemning psychology, condemning psychiatry, and then just the tendency of us to sort of be self-sufficient, to rely on priesthood leaders, makes it so I didn't learn about what a woman's shelter was until someone in my family needed it and it was there. And that was in the past, let's just say 5 years. And how is it that I got almost a PhD in psychology and didn't learn about what a woman's shelter was? It's because I was in a religion that tended to be disconnected from resources in the community and tended to downplay or dismiss or even demonize professional resources that are available all around us. And so there's something just underlying Mormon culture where we've got to get out of ourselves. We've got to become humble to learn that there are other great resources out there, including non-Mormon specialists in mental disorders and women's shelters and other sorts of things that can be really helpful, right? Because we just tend to think we can do it all ourselves. And the priesthood doesn't fix PTSD. It doesn't fix eating disorders. Even experts in eating disorders have a hard time fixing eating disorders. Mm-hmm. The gospel's not going to fix it.
Right.
Yeah. So was it Todd that was this understanding bishop?
That kept calling, kept having his executive secretary call me in like once a month, and he probably did that, 6 or 7 months before I finally was like, I trusted him enough to talk to him.
So was Todd your bishop?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's switch to Todd. So Todd, tell us how so you're at this point a tell us, were you an Orthodox believing member when you became bishop, or was your story a little bit more nuanced or complex than that?
I'm a pretty Orthodox believer. There were some questions that I had, but most of the questions about the church I've been able to study and answer. There may have been there were some that remained, but I never want to be bishop. It terrified me, the responsibility of being a representative for Christ. and for being responsible for the members of the ward and their lives and counseling them and knowing that they look to me as Christ, as a counselor. And I didn't want the responsibility, but when I was told I was going to be the bishop, I put any question I had about the church and relied completely on the faith that I had, and tried to do the best job that I could to be a good bishop to help the people in my ward. Because it was a student ward, they had the option of attending my ward or a different ward. So they're extremely faithful congregation. Over 90% of them had temple recommends, paid full tithing. Majority of them were BYU students, and the ones that weren't were taking institute classes. Jen and her husband, they came to my ward because Jen didn't mention this, but because her husband got into an altercation with the Sunday school president. An old man in the ward got disagreement, and I guess it got physical, and so I don't know, they got kicked out of the ward, but pretty much left the ward.
Made the choice to switch because we could.
Yeah, so they made this choice to leave that ward and come over to mine. So, I was set apart and took the position very seriously.
So what mental health background did you have, or pastoral training did you have prior to, becoming bishop?
I was a father. That was it. My background is in business management, and so I run corporations, but I had no experience at all. And that's probably one of the reasons I didn't want the position. But when I was called to be the bishop, the question was from the stake president, is there anything in your life that would make you unworthy to be able to serve as the bishop of the ward? And I said, no. Congratulations, you've been approved by the first presidency. Here's your certificate. You're now the bishop of the ward.
And this again is something we need to take a pause and note. In other churches, you study for years to become a pastor or a preacher. You get a master's in divinity, or you do that training, and you get years of counseling as it relates to, the basics of mental health and the basics of counseling and knowing your limits and how to refer and how to deal with issues like abuse and marital difficulties. And I think it's fun that the church, well, it's not fun, but, so the church likes to sort of brag or say, hey, our leaders are just carpenters or school teachers or businessmen. We don't pay them, and it's just people who volunteer their time. Yeah, and you sort of get what you pay for. And so if you just have these volunteer people who don't have a background in a training, then they're not equipped to handle these issues. And they come to every bishop. I don't think there's ever been a bishop who served 5 years who didn't have sexual abuse, physical abuse, severe marital problems, severe mental illness as a part of what they had to minister. And so did you feel, Todd, just unprepared and unequipped for the things that you imagine you'd be facing?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to express it. But from my point of view, the only thing that I had was prayer. And I'd never prayed so hard in my life as I did as I was serving as bishop to find the answers, because I didn't have them.
So the best you had is prayer.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And overall, how effective was prayer in treating an eating disorder, prayer as a bishop in treating an eating disorder, in curing post-traumatic stress disorder, in fixing an abusive marriage? How did prayer work?
Jen would be better to qualified to answer the question, but it was all that I had, and I felt at times it was helpful, not knowing an alternative.
Sure.
Ultimately, fast forward a couple of years, I came to the conclusion that it didn't work.
Yeah. Okay. So how did you, what signs did you get that Jen was in distress and needed help? How did you know?
Well, the ward was really transient because it was a student congregation. People were constantly moving in and moving out, and I wanted to make sure that I paid attention to the lost sheep, to those that were less active, to those that sat on the back row, to those that were quiet. And I wanted to, my counselors and I, we would regularly go out after bishopric meeting during the week and visit with new members. And Jen and her husband were some that were fit that category. That I noticed she was pretty quiet, and they seemed like a family that I needed to get to know better among the rest of them. And so, as Jen had said, I called them in. I asked her to come in. I asked them both to come in and meet with me. And when they came in, I would ask her a question, and her husband would answer. And she seemed to be pretty reticent, and I thought that I felt like there was something else that was going on there that I needed to get to know more. I suspected, because he seemed to be pretty dominant in the interview, that there was something else going on. So I just felt there was a problem there that needed some investigation.
Okay. So tell us how you became a support to Jen during this difficult time.
Well, I guess after meeting with her and her husband, I asked her to come in and talk with me by herself. And during the interview with her and her husband, he told me that she had had an eating disorder in the past, but that was no longer part of her. And this was after she had had the miscarriage. So as they came in, he told me that there wasn't an eating disorder. But when I met with her finally individually, she told me that during the interview that the eating disorder had returned, and that she was struggling with not eating. And I didn't know what to do, and so it's something that was out of my hands. I referred her to a therapist at LDS Family Services.
Okay.
So she started meeting with the therapist
For the eating disorder.
for the eating disorder.
And did you know which ones you referred to were experts in eating disorders?
I had no idea. I just knew that I couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
I didn't know what to do, so I referred her to the LDS Family Services.
And you didn't even know that she needed an expert in eating disorders, not just a general
No,
therapist. Yeah.
no, I had no experience at all with an eating disorder.
Okay.
So in addition to that, I scoured the internet. I scoured conference talks. I scoured everything I could because LDS Family Services charged the ward. It came out of our fast offering funds, and they weren't done. There were money there to be spent, but I was still sacred obligation to make sure that those funds were spent carefully. And so in addition to her meeting with a therapist, I was trying to do the best that I could to help from an ecclesiastical standpoint.
With the eating disorder?
With the eating disorder, with her life, with, I don't remember the timeline, but there was a point where I met with her husband to talk with him concerning some things he had personally going on. And he got violent with me in my office and tried to get my desk and shove it against me and pin me against the wall. And he was very violent. And I didn't know what had provoked him. I thought it was just asking him questions about his life. So I knew at that point that if he's violent with me, there's a high chance he's also violent with his wife.
And
so I was concerned for her physical.
And as a bishop, what kept you? You're a full-grown man.
Right.
You're a bishop. You have the priesthood. You have the authority. You're the leader of the congregation. Mm-hmm. What kept you from calling the police or turning this guy in?
I told him that I was going to call the police, and that's why he backed off and didn't further his attack on me. But I didn't, I'm not going to call the police on a member of the ward.
Why? That's important. Why would a bishop not want to call the police on a member of the ward?
Well, because Jen didn't want me to, and she didn't want her husband going to jail, and he was struggling they were struggling financially. I'm helping them with fast offerings funds to meet their obligations. And it didn't really occur to me, and I didn't want the consequences of it. And I was the bishop. I wasn't the victim. I didn't think it was, really my place to call the authorities.
Yeah, because as a bishop, you're trying to heal things and make it better. You're not trying to put people in jail,
Right.
make things harder.
Yeah, because it would have, financially would have been difficult on them.
Right. And what training did you get around police and when to notify the police and when not to?
None. I mean, bishop training was consisting of the bishops in the stake getting together and talking about problems in the ward without divulging personal information, but discussing challenges and how to help people to go through the process of repentance and forgiveness and things of that nature. There wasn't anything. And, again, the counseling that I received, if there's something that was over my head, to refer them to a therapist at LDS Family Services, and that's what I'd done.
Okay. So, Jen, there's a question that's coming for you. There are several people just wanting to know if your family knew about your abusive husband, your second abusive husband, or if you did not let them know, and if not, why?
My family did not know. That was a big one. That was like the teachings of the church, that you don't take problems of your marriage outside of your marriage. So, I mean, you might think abuse is different, but it wasn't for me. It was that's a problem within my marriage. I'm not going to take it outside my marriage. And so, and maybe there was a part of me that knew that he could go to jail or could get, and I didn't want to deal with that either. So, no, I hadn't talked to my family. I was protecting him.
Okay. And was the person that Todd referred you to, Bishop Todd, was this therapist an expert in eating disorders? And if so, what was the treatment from LDS Family Services for your eating disorder?
She told me I didn't look like I had an eating disorder. I was probably fine. And I said, oh, good. And
so she wasn't an expert.
She was not an expert, because people that are experts don't say stuff like that.
What do they say?
They'll ask about behavior maybe, but they understand that eating disorders are such a mental thing that I'm not quite sure how a therapist would start probably asking about behaviors, but as far as treatment, it's trying to deal with emotions so that you don't use behaviors.
Right. So was this person effective in your treatment, LDS Family Services?
No. And so I only went to her, I don't know, a few times, and said, this isn't really helpful. It's not going anywhere. And besides, she says I don't have an eating disorder anyways.
Right. Okay.
Though I was aware enough of eating disorders to know that what she was saying was not true, but that also scares me, because if I was aware enough, there's a whole bunch of people that are so deep in eating disorder land that they don't know that they're sick. And if someone said that to them, that would be the end. They would say, see, I'm not sick, I'm fine, and I don't deserve help.
Right.
So.
One of our listeners, Rachel, says that she still hasn't told hers, so she gets it. So I'm assuming, I mean, I don't know, but is Rachel saying that she's a victim of abuse and hasn't told her parents? If so, Rachel, I do hope you'll get help. Melissa says, I didn't tell my family about the abuse in my marriage because I thought I deserved the abuse. Thank you, Melissa. And that goes back to, Jen, what you had said earlier again about always placing the blame on you. Anne says, me too, Melissa. It had a lot to do with what I felt my worth was. So when people, and specifically women, are continually taught that they're lesser than, that the men have the authority, that the men are the leaders, and women aren't given careers and empowerment to sort of build up their own resources, then they're really subject to the power and the money and the influence of their male husband. Mm-hmm. And so women are very much disempowered in that case. Todd, Melissa is wondering what questions you were asking that would make Jen's husband get so mad at you and start pushing the desk into you and being violent?
I don't remember. I remember some other information from other things, details about the interview, but they're confidential that I couldn't reveal.
Okay, you couldn't talk about it anyway.
No, but I don't remember specifically, but he
Sure.
was confessing some things he'd done.
Okay, so Todd, how did you help Jen?
Well, at this time,
I want to answer that question.
yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Because the thing that he did that for me, the moment it was almost life-changing for me, was that he was giving, I mean, at this point, he's still trying to give me conference talks. He told me there's nothing for me to repent for, but I definitely need help. And he's done all that. And I finally it's like I feel so frustrated that I said, you don't understand, and I don't have the time or the energy to help you. And his response was, I know I don't understand. I know I don't have a clue, but I want to, and I will do everything I can. If you will explain it to me, I will give you 100% of my listening, and I will try to understand. And so, I mean, we're talking a lifetime of feeling like I am unimportant and unseen and I don't matter. And somehow in that 1 minute he told me, I see you and I want to hear you and I want to understand and I'm sorry that I don't. And so I was like, an apology and to try to make it right, and he sees me. And from there, probably I think we still talked about conference talks and still we're trying, but
Yeah, because those were the resources that I had. And because the ward was paying for her therapy, LDS Family Services, the therapist would report back to me, and Jen consented to it. So I knew what they were discussing. And at one point, the therapist did recognize that she wasn't prepared to help with the eating disorder. And she said that referred her to a different therapist that did specialize in eating disorders. So that did happen. And I don't remember how long it took, but it was a couple months probably. And she realized she was overhead, and she referred her to a specialist.
Okay.
Outside of LDS Family Services.
So Jen, how long were you counseling with Todd as a member of a ward and a bishop?
Well, and he was my bishop for 3.5 years. And it was pretty soon after he was called that he started calling me in, so. And because we came into the ward like a month before he was called to be the bishop, so it was.
Okay. So for more than 2 years. And how did things progress then? You have the abusive husband, you see the eating disorder, you see the LDS Family Services therapist. How did things proceed? Talk to us about the course of change for you over those 2.5 years. Did things get better? Did they not?
Well, yes, things got better.
So we started by believing you and seeing you and empowering you. How did it advance? Did the violence go away?
Eventually, we eventually got divorced, but he also, eventually the violence went away. I'm trying to think, Todd was very involved in keeping me alive. So I told him I was struggling with an eating disorder, and he did what he'd done with other people struggling with other addictions, check in with me on a daily basis. So I was checking in with him on a daily basis, which then just created a relationship of trust too, that it was, so I was checking in with him on a daily basis. I'd get a text from him every morning asking if I'd had breakfast. He was aware of me pretty much all the time, even if we weren't talking
Yeah.
And I know I'm not the only member he did this for.
Yeah.
He was.
Yeah, there were a number of people in the ward that were dealing with various addictions, and so I kept in contact with them. But at some point, and you remember better than I do, the PTSD was being triggered by sleep. And so when she went in to meet with a therapist, and he was an LDS therapist, even though he wasn't through LDS Family Therapy or Family Services that specialized in eating disorders. And Jen's physical health and mental health was very weak at that time, not only because she wasn't eating, but she combined that with excessive exercise. And so she was very weak, and she'd come to my office, and sometimes she would pass out. And I took her to the emergency room, and they gave her apple juice and told her that she was hadn't had enough to drink. She was dehydrated. I'm thinking dried out. So she was dehydrated. So they gave her some things and took her home. And they didn't have any health insurance, so they didn't have any resources to get the help that they needed. And at this point, she still was in denial of the problem. She still didn't recognize that what had happened to her before was traumatic from the first husband, let alone what she was dealing with the second husband. At that point, she's not dealing with any of those issues. The only explanation she has for the eating disorder is that she's crazy. So just eat. How many calories have you eaten? And she would tell me how many calories she'd eaten, but she worked it all off, and she was walking constantly. At work, there was a office building, and she would go to the fire stairs and go up and down the stairs all the time to burn off any calories that she ate. So, and it took a physical and mental toll, which was what the eating disorder did. It was benefited her because she was avoiding the painful emotions of dealing with the trauma she'd had in the past. And she wanted to die.
And she was having at present, like with her current spouse.
Yes.
As well, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she starts dealing with the PTSD, which I say is triggered by sleep. So she was going for literally days with no sleep, on top of the eating disorder, on top of the exercise. And she's just taking diet pills. And as I say, she's passing out in the bishop's office. And so I'd have to get her and a member of one of the other, and usually by the time I was meeting, there was somebody else on the stake or on the ward would help her to her car. And as long as she was sitting up, she wouldn't pass out. But if she stood up, she was so dizzy that she would just fall over. And she thought that was normal. She thought it was normal to not be able to stand. And it wasn't just when she went from sitting to standing position, but just standing there, she would get dizzy. She'd pass out in my office. She'd pass out at church. She was in a tough position. And as she said before, the suicide ideation, what that meant was she wanted to die all of the time. She would hear of somebody who went up the canyon and they couldn't find them, and several days later they found her body, and she just wished that was her.
Yeah. Couple quick things. I'm not an expert in eating disorders, but the little I know about them, anorexia is associated with restricting, intake, restricting food. That's anorexia. Some of you may have heard of bulimia. Bulimia is associated with purging. And a lot of times when we think of purging, we think of eating the food and then vomiting it back up. And that is a form of purging. But excessive exercise is also thought of as a form of purging. So instead of throwing up, you engage in excessive exercise. And that can qualify someone, as I understand it, for a bulimia diagnosis. That doesn't mean that was your diagnosis, but that's just letting people know that bulimia doesn't necessarily have to be purging through throwing up.
Right.
It can also be purging through laxatives. So instead of throwing up, you just take laxatives that make the food just pass right through your system.
I'm a little bit worried that we're giving a whole bunch of lists of how-tos.
Right.
I know there's a ton of pro-ANA, they call them, websites where people can find it, but I'm a little bit concerned.
Okay, so talk about the risks there and what the better way to talk about it would be.
I don't know, because I do know that talking about the behavior is kind of important for other people to understand. But those that are going through eating disorders or have the eating disorders are so mental. So I'll just really quick, like I didn't deserve food, and if I didn't, and if I stopped moving, then the world felt like it was crashing in around me. So all the behaviors were things I used. Hearing the list of behaviors is like, well, if you're in that mindset, it's like, haven't tried that one yet. Maybe I'll try that one. So that's part makes me.
Yeah, that's not my intention to make that list, but for people to understand, you know, what she was dealing with.
Right.
Yeah, that we have to.
So I guess for me, so maybe it's if you're having those thoughts,
get help.
Or behaviors.
Or behaviors, or you're thinking, if one of these thoughts is, I haven't tried that, go get help. That's not.
Yeah, right.
So, there's my.
Understood. Another question for both of you. You know, when somebody is like passing out, not eating, suicidal, those of us who are observers can easily go to that place of like, well, they have borderline personality disorder. They have it's parasuicidal behavior. It's some sort of personality disorder. They're just kind of, maybe they're bipolar, but we can jump to these sort of really severe labels and then sometimes say, I can't handle this. This is too much. This person's just beyond what I can do. I just can't imagine what it's like to be a bishop, to have a wife and kids, to have a full-time job, and you have one or more members of your congregation that you're worrying about on a daily basis. And Jen, you're getting emotional. What are you feeling?
Well, I mean, I know Todd's story. I know how much it nearly broke him to care about me, but he did. I mean, how easy would it have been to dismiss me? I mean, and a good portion of my passing out was eating disorder. A good portion was dissociation. I was a mess. I mean, so how easy would it have been for him to say, this is too much and I'm done. And I wouldn't be sitting here. Because Todd damn near saved my life with his tenacious stubbornness.
It's beautiful. Todd, what was that like for you to have? Was this the only ward member that had this level of severity?
It was the only one that had that level of severity. There was another member of the ward that was a veteran of war, and he also was dealing with PTSD, but through the VA, and he had independent help. So eventually Jen went into an inpatient facility through the therapist. And so I didn't have any experience. I didn't know what to expect from the treatment. And when she went in full-time to this treatment center, I felt a lot of relief that, okay, she's going to get the help that she needs.
But what was the burden on you and your family and your job to have a member of the ward in such a severe situation, along with all the other ward responsibilities you had?
It was very, very strenuous. At that point, I was pretty much self-employed, and so I was able to devote more time than I would have if I was still had a full-time job. But it was very strenuous. It was strenuous on me. It was also strenuous on my family, and it got worse. I mean, it got more intense.
Jen did.
I thought that the eating disorder center would help things be all better, but lo and behold, the path to healing, you have to deal with all of the things that happen to you. You deal with those emotions. You talk about the things that happened, which she didn't up until that point. But after she was healthy enough, after going through the treatment, then she started dealing with the emotions, and things got worse.
Things got worse?
Yeah.
So Jen, how were you dealing with the emotions?
At that point, I did a lot of writing. And I did a lot of not dealing. I mean, I did have, so because of the inpatient, I went with some amazing women. Like, they were so recovery focused, and so I had a really good friend base that we'd all been through the trauma, we'd all been through, like, and been willing to talk about it with each other and share the very real consequences of it. So I had them, and so I talked with them. We were all over the country, but hours a day, talking with them, talking with them and writing, and I'm still in therapy, and trying to find hobbies and things to do. But he started talking about sleep, and it wasn't till after I left and being inpatient that it was like going to sleep because of what my first husband did was often either while I was asleep or just before I went to sleep. Going to sleep made it triggered all the PTSD symptoms, and so that was when it was at the worst, was when I was trying to sleep next to my current husband. Having him there just made it worse. So I'd go days without sleeping and trying to still, and it's funny that it's like at this point I'm still showing up to work and I'm still like kind of being normal there while I'm broken in every other place in my life.